Jerusalem, the city of kings, lies under a blanket of night. The air is still, save for the distant murmur of wind brushing against the walls of King David's palace. The grandeur of the structure, once a testament to God's chosen ruler, now casts long shadows in the moonlight, as if even the walls bear the weight of what has transpired within. Have you ever heard the story of the wisest man who, despite all of God's gifts, fell into the darkness of his own weaknesses? A man who, though blessed beyond measure, was brought to ruin not by his enemies, but by his own choices? To understand Solomon, we must first look to his father, King David, whose reign was marked by triumph and tragedy. David, the shepherd king, was beloved by God, the slayer of giants, the unifier of Israel. His victories were many, his songs of worship even more. But no man is perfect, and David's flaw came in the form of desire for a woman named Bathsheba. From his rooftop, David saw her, and in that moment, a chain of events was set into motion that would change the course of his dynasty forever. Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, a loyal soldier, became David's obsession. In a moment of weakness, he took her for himself, and when she became pregnant, he devised a plan to cover his sin. Uriah was sent to the front lines of battle, a death sentence written by the hand of his own king. This grave act did not go unnoticed by God. Though David would later repent, the consequences of his sin echoed through the years. Bathsheba gave birth to a son, Solomon. Solomon, born out of an affair shrouded in deceit and murder, was destined for greatness. Yet, his very existence was a reminder of the chaos and brokenness that had ushered him into the world. A child of both favor and sorrow, Solomon carried the weight of his father's sin and the promise of something greater. What future could await someone born out of chaos? Would he rise above the sins of his father, or would he, too, be drawn into the same darkness? Solomon ascended to the throne of Israel as a young and uncertain king. The shadows of his father's legacy loomed large, casting doubt over his ability to rule such a vast and powerful kingdom. The weight of responsibility was heavy on his shoulders, for he was not just a king. He was the son of David, chosen by God to continue the line of a divine promise. But how could one so young and inexperienced carry such a burden? One night, Solomon found himself at a crossroads. The decisions he would make in the days to come would shape not only his own destiny, but that of Israel itself. As he slept, God appeared to him in a dream. It was an encounter that would change the course of history. "Ask what I shall give you," God said, offering Solomon the chance to request anything his heart desired. It was a moment of unimaginable opportunity. Power, riches, fame, even long life. All were within Solomon's grasp. Yet, in that moment, he did not ask for the things most kings would crave. Instead, with humility that belied his youth, Solomon uttered words that would echo through the ages. "Give your servant an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil." Solomon's request was simple, yet profound. He sought wisdom, not for his own gain, but to lead God's people justly. This selflessness pleased God, and in return, Solomon received not only the wisdom he had asked for, but also wealth, honor, and power beyond any king who had come before or would follow. With divine wisdom now flowing through him, Solomon's reign began to take shape. His judgments became renowned across the land, none more famous than the case of two women, each claiming to be the mother of the same child. The crowd waited in tense silence as Solomon called for a sword, commanding that the baby be cut in half, with each woman receiving a part. Gasps filled the court, but when one woman, in a cry of desperation, begged that the child be given to the other woman rather than see it harmed, Solomon knew the truth. It was she who was the real mother. His wisdom had revealed what logic alone could not. Israel marveled at their king's brilliance, and soon Solomon's fame spread far beyond the borders of his kingdom. Kings and queens from distant lands came to witness the wisdom of Israel's new ruler. But as the world bowed before him, was there something darker brewing beneath the surface? With so much power and divine wisdom, was Solomon destined for greatness, or was something darker lying in wait? The seeds of his future glory had been planted, but so too had the seeds of his eventual downfall. For even the wisest of men are not immune to the temptations of power, wealth, and pride. In the years that followed, Solomon's wisdom flourished, and with it, Israel reached unprecedented heights of wealth and glory. The crown jewel of his reign would be the construction of a temple, God's temple, in Jerusalem, a house of worship unlike anything the world had ever seen. The vision was grand. It would be a place where the God of Israel would dwell among his people, a symbol of divine favor and a testament to Solomon's greatness. The preparations were meticulous. Cedar wood was brought from Lebanon, gold and silver were amassed in abundance, and the finest artisans were summoned to ensure that every detail reflected the majesty of the Almighty. Day and night, the sounds of hammers and chisels echoed throughout the city as thousands of workers toiled to bring Solomon's vision to life. The temple rose from the ground like a living monument, its walls adorned with carvings of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. Its foundation was laid in strength, its pillars in splendor. Inside, the inner sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, was overlaid with pure gold, and the Ark of the Covenant, the very throne of God on earth, would rest within its sacred walls. When the day of dedication arrived, the people of Israel gathered from every corner of the land. Solomon, in all his glory, stood before them. As the priests carried the ark into the temple, a cloud filled the holy place. The glory of the Lord had descended upon it. The people fell to their knees in awe. Solomon lifted his voice in prayer, dedicating the temple to God and asking for his blessing upon Israel. It was a day of unparalleled glory, a moment when it seemed as though Israel was invincible, basking in the favor of God and the brilliance of its king. The world took notice. From the distant lands of Africa, Arabia, and beyond, leaders traveled to see for themselves the splendor of Solomon's kingdom. None were more notable than the Queen of Sheba. She arrived in Jerusalem with a great retinue, bringing spices, gold, and precious stones as gifts for Solomon. But it was not the riches of his kingdom that had drawn her. It was his famed wisdom. She came with hard questions, riddles that no ordinary man could answer. Yet, with each query, Solomon responded with ease, unraveling the mysteries that perplexed even the greatest minds. The queen was left breathless, marveling not only at Solomon's intellect, but at the sheer wealth and organization of his kingdom. "The report I heard in my own land was true," she said, "but not even half of it was told to me." Solomon had reached the pinnacle of his power. The temple stood as a beacon of Israel's glory. His wisdom had become legendary, and his wealth seemed inexhaustible. The nations of the world looked to him as the embodiment of greatness, and for a time, it seemed that nothing could diminish the brilliance of his reign. But beneath the golden exterior, cracks were beginning to form. For all his wisdom and wealth, Solomon was still human. The demands of maintaining such a vast empire were great, and with every political alliance, every treaty, there came a price. But this glory would come with a price Solomon could not foresee. In his quest for greatness, Solomon began to make decisions that would, in time, lead to his downfall. For even the wisest of kings cannot escape the consequences of their choices, and Solomon's desire for power and prestige would lead him down a path from which there would be no return. At the height of Solomon's reign, his wisdom and wealth knew no bounds, but even the wisest of men can have blind spots. For Solomon, that blind spot was women. His love for them was vast, spanning beyond the borders of Israel, pulling him toward alliances that would gradually unravel his once glorious reign. Solomon had 700 wives, princesses from neighboring kingdoms, and 300 concubines. Each marriage was more than a personal desire. It was a strategic move. Each wife brought with her the promise of peace between nations, alliances that strengthened Israel's position on the world stage. But these women also brought something far more dangerous: foreign gods. The influence of these foreign wives began to seep into Solomon's court, slowly but surely drawing him away from the God of Israel. It was not an immediate fall, but a gradual drift. At first, Solomon allowed his wives to worship their gods in private, building small altars in hidden corners of the city. Then, as his affection for them grew, so too did the prominence of these foreign deities. Soon, temples and high places for gods like Ashtoreth, Chemosh, and Molech dotted the hills around Jerusalem, rivaling the very temple that Solomon had built for the Lord. Each compromise seemed small, but collectively, they marked the beginning of Solomon's spiritual decline. He, who had once been the chosen king, favored with divine wisdom, now stood at the heart of a nation divided between the worship of the true God and the gods of wood and stone. It's hard to imagine, isn't it? The man who had built the greatest temple in history, the man who had been granted wisdom directly from God, was now bowing to the desires of his heart. Could the wisest man in the world really be losing control of his own destiny? The answer was painfully clear. Solomon's weakness for women had not only led him to forsake his God, but it had also led him to forsake the very principles that had once made him great. The women of foreign nations had introduced him to new ways of thinking, new forms of worship, and in his desire to please them, Solomon had turned a blind eye to the spiritual decay that was spreading like a disease throughout Israel. But this was not just a personal failure. Solomon's actions had consequences for the entire nation. The people of Israel, seeing their king, their once wise and righteous king, building altars to false gods, began to question their own faith. If Solomon, the man chosen by God, could worship these gods, then what harm could there be in doing the same? Slowly, the worship of the Lord became diluted, mixed with the rituals of foreign nations. The purity of Israel's faith, which had once been its strength, was now crumbling under the weight of Solomon's compromises. What had begun as a political strategy had become a spiritual catastrophe. And yet, Solomon did not stop. Blinded by his love for these women, and perhaps by his own pride, he continued down the path of destruction, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge, that the very kingdom he had worked so hard to build was now teetering on the edge of collapse. The great king, the wise Solomon, had lost his way. As the years passed, the once glorious kingdom of Israel began to bear the marks of spiritual corruption. The altars Solomon had built for foreign gods were no longer hidden or discreet. They stood tall and proud, rivaling the magnificence of the temple Solomon had once dedicated to the Lord. The sight was jarring. A kingdom that had been chosen to worship the one true God now bowed before idols of stone, wood, and bronze. The foreign gods Solomon had permitted into Israel's heartland were not passive symbols. They demanded sacrifices, rituals, and devotion, and they poisoned the soul of the nation. Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites, were particularly vile, requiring horrific acts of worship, even child sacrifice. It was no longer just Solomon's personal compromise. The very fabric of Israel's faith had begun to unravel. The people followed their king's example. They offered incense at the altars. They bowed before false gods. And with each act, they drifted further from the covenant that had once bound them to the Lord. Solomon had allowed this corruption to fester, and now the consequences were becoming clear. The spiritual decay was not limited to the royal court. It spread across the land, infecting the hearts of the people, weakening the very foundation of the nation. In moments of solitude, Solomon must have felt the weight of what he had done. The wisdom that had once been his guiding light now seemed distant, obscured by the choices he had made. Did he justify his actions, telling himself that these alliances were necessary for the stability of the kingdom? Did he believe that God's favor would remain with him despite the mounting idolatry? Or deep down, did he realize that he had lost his way? Perhaps, in the quiet of his palace, Solomon wrestled with his conscience. Maybe he heard the echoes of his father David's psalms, calling him back to the God of Israel. But if those thoughts ever crossed his mind, they were quickly drowned out by the demands of ruling a kingdom built on fragile foundations. The discontent among the people grew. The once proud nation of Israel, renowned for its faithfulness to the Lord, now found itself lost, adrift in a sea of foreign gods and divided loyalties. Solomon had led them to this place. The kingdom was at risk, not from external enemies, but from within. The man who built God's temple was now building altars for other gods. How could this end? The answer was becoming increasingly clear. The seeds of Solomon's choices were beginning to bear fruit, and the harvest would be bitter. Israel, once united and strong, was now fractured spiritually, and soon that fracture would manifest in ways Solomon could no longer control. The people were restless, the Lord was distant, and Solomon, the man who had once been the wisest in all the world, now stood on the precipice of ruin, both for himself and for his kingdom. As Solomon's kingdom grew in wealth and splendor, so too did the cost of maintaining it. The vast palaces, the exotic imports, and the endless construction projects, including the towering altars for his foreign wives, demanded resources, and those resources had to come from somewhere. The burden fell upon the people of Israel. To sustain his luxurious lifestyle and grand ambitions, Solomon imposed heavy taxes on his subjects. The once prosperous citizens of Israel now found themselves under the yoke of an increasingly oppressive regime. Fields that had once yielded harvests for their own families now served to fill the king's treasuries. The people, who had once rejoiced at Solomon's wisdom, now whispered in quiet corners of his excess and the weight of his demands. But taxes were not the only burden. Solomon instituted forced labor, compelling his own people to work on his grand projects. Men were conscripted to quarry stones, to construct fortresses and cities, to maintain the roads that connected his vast empire. What had once been a nation united under the promise of God now felt the strain of a king who seemed more concerned with his own glory than the welfare of his people. The murmurs of discontent grew louder. In distant regions, whispers of rebellion began to stir. Solomon's grip on power, once absolute, was beginning to slip. The people were no longer content to bear the cost of his extravagance, and the sense of injustice spread like wildfire. Even the wisest of kings can be blinded by ambition. How much longer would the people endure? The contrast between Solomon's external glory and the internal decay of his kingdom became starker with each passing year. On the surface, Israel seemed to flourish. Its cities gleamed, its army stood strong, and its king was renowned across the known world. But beneath this facade, the cracks in the foundation were becoming impossible to ignore. Solomon had achieved everything he had once desired: wisdom, wealth, power, and prestige. Yet, in doing so, he had alienated the very people he was called to lead. The price of his decisions was being paid in the suffering of his people, and the consequences of his actions were beginning to catch up with him. The once golden kingdom of Israel was on the verge of collapse, not from external enemies, but from the growing unrest within its own borders. As the years passed, Solomon, once the embodiment of wisdom and divine favor, grew old and weary. His kingdom, once united and flourishing, had begun to fracture under the weight of his decisions. The heavy taxes, forced labor, and spiritual corruption had created deep fissures in the heart of Israel, and those cracks were about to split wide open. Solomon, now a shadow of his former self, sat on his throne, surrounded by the splendor of his palace, but haunted by the consequences of his reign. His wisdom, once his greatest gift, now seemed to torment him as he reflected on the choices he had made. The idols that stood in his kingdom were not just symbols of his wives' foreign gods. They were monuments to his own failure to remain faithful to the Lord. His glory had come at a price, and that price was the loyalty of his people and the purity of their faith. Upon Solomon's death, the kingdom he had worked so hard to build did not remain whole. The seeds of rebellion that had been sown during his later years quickly sprouted into full-scale division. The northern tribes, discontent with the oppression and heavy-handed rule they had endured, rejected Solomon's son, Rehoboam, as their king. Led by Jeroboam, a former official in Solomon's court, they declared independence, forming the new kingdom of Israel in the north, leaving Rehoboam to rule over the southern kingdom of Judah. The once mighty nation, united under David and expanded under Solomon, was now broken into two: Israel in the north and Judah in the south, two kingdoms that would walk separate paths, divided not only by geography, but by their loyalties and their relationship with God. This division marked the beginning of a long period of instability, conflict, and eventual exile. The northern kingdom of Israel, under the leadership of Jeroboam, quickly fell into deeper idolatry, far surpassing even Solomon's compromises. Altars to foreign gods became commonplace, and the people drifted further from the God who had once delivered them from Egypt and brought them to the Promised Land. In the south, Judah clung to its identity as the house of David, but even there, the seeds of Solomon's idolatry and spiritual compromise remained. Kings would rise and fall, some righteous, some wicked, but the nation never fully recovered from the division Solomon's reign had set into motion. The wisest king in history left behind a legacy of greatness and ruin. Solomon's name would forever be associated with the heights of Israel's glory, but also with its downfall. His wealth, wisdom, and power were unmatched, but in the end, they were not enough to save him from his own weaknesses. His story serves as a sobering reminder that even the most gifted and blessed among us are vulnerable to the seductions of pride, wealth, and desire. Solomon's fall was not an external conquest, but an internal collapse, a kingdom torn apart by the very man who was meant to shepherd it. And now, in the twilight of his life, Solomon could do nothing but watch as the nation he had once ruled with wisdom splintered before his eyes. Solomon's life is a cautionary tale, one of immense potential, divine blessing, and tragic failure. He was a man chosen by God, gifted with wisdom beyond measure, wealth beyond comprehension, and power that stretched far beyond Israel's borders. And yet, for all his gifts, he fell not to an outside enemy, but to the temptations that lay within his own heart. In his rise, Solomon built a kingdom that was the envy of the world. His wisdom drew rulers from distant lands, his wealth was unparalleled, and the temple he built for God became the centerpiece of Israel's spiritual life. But even the wisest of men can be blinded by their own desires. Solomon's downfall began with the small compromises, decisions that seemed insignificant at first. Marriages for political gain, small altars for his wives' gods, indulgence in wealth and luxury. But over time, these choices chipped away at his devotion to the Lord. What started as a small drift became a catastrophic fall. His heart, once filled with the love of God, became divided by his love for the world and its temptations. The kingdom he left behind was divided, broken by the very choices he had made. The spiritual corruption he allowed to flourish in his later years led to idolatry, rebellion, and ultimately, the fall of Israel and Judah. His legacy, once marked by wisdom and greatness, became tainted by failure and ruin. What can we learn from Solomon's story? It is a reminder of the fragility of even the greatest among us. The wisdom of Solomon did not protect him from the lure of power, wealth, and desire. His story urges us to remain faithful, to guard our hearts against the small compromises that lead us astray. In the end, Solomon's temple, once filled with the glory of God, now stands empty, a shadow of the greatness that once was. And so, the question remains, what legacy will you leave behind? Wisdom or ruin?